I used to think love could survive anything until I realized sometimes the people who promise to protect you are the very ones who destroy you from the inside. My name is Emily Parker. I am 32 years old, a first-grade teacher in a small Oregon town where everyone knows everyone. Or at least, that's what they think. From the outside, my life looked peaceful. A cozy house with a white fence, a husband who smiled at church on Sundays, and a mother-in-law who baked pies for the neighbors. But behind that picture-perfect door, I was slowly disappearing. It started small. "Emily, you shouldn't wear that," Linda, my mother-in-law, would say with a sweet but cutting tone. "Daniel prefers women who dress modestly." And Daniel, my husband, would just nod. At first, I laughed it off. Then I stopped laughing. Over time, her comments grew sharper and his silences louder. I'd come home after teaching 25 noisy little angels all day, and instead of a hug, I'd find Daniel scrolling on his phone, his mother's voice filling the kitchen. "Emily didn't clean the counter," or "Emily forgot to iron the curtains." And he'd look at me, disappointed, as if I'd failed another test I didn't even know I was taking. It's funny how control doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like being ignored. One evening, I sat alone in the living room while Daniel and his mother laughed over dinner in the kitchen. I could hear her say, "She's not like us, Daniel. She doesn't understand family." And he didn't defend me, not once. I started feeling like a guest in my own home. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was walking on eggshells that would never stop cracking. I'd cry in the shower, whispering to myself, "You're not crazy, Emily. You're not crazy." But the more I tried to convince myself, the less I believed it. And yet, I still hope things would change, that Daniel would notice how hard I tried, that Linda would soften, that maybe if I just stayed quiet, everything would go back to how it was. But deep down, I knew silence only feeds the fire. One day, while driving home from work, I passed a group of my students playing in the park. They waved at me with sticky hands and bright smiles. I smiled back, but my eyes burned, because they still believed the world was kind. They still believed love meant safety. I envied them. If you've ever felt like you were walking on eggshells in your own home, share your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it. And if this story feels close to your heart, hit subscribe. I promise no one deserves to feel invisible. That night, I sat by the window while the rain hit the glass. Linda's voice carried from the hallway. "You should be grateful, Emily. Daniel provides for you. Not every woman is that lucky." Grateful. That word stung. Grateful for what? For losing myself piece by piece? For living in a house where my laughter didn't belong? I stared out into the dark and whispered, "Maybe I'm not the lucky one after all." I didn't know it then, but that moment, that quiet whisper to myself, was the first crack in the wall they'd built around me. And soon, everything inside would start to break open. Because when you're pushed to the edge long enough, you stop being afraid of the fall. I kept telling myself that marriage was about patience, that if I loved hard enough, if I gave more, maybe he'd remember who we used to be. There was a time when Daniel looked at me like I was his whole world. Back when we were broke and happy, living in a tiny apartment that smelled like coffee and rain. We used to dream about road trips, adoption, a garden in the backyard. I kept telling myself that marriage was about patience, that if I loved hard enough, if I gave more, maybe he'd remember who we used to be. There was a time when Daniel looked at me like I was his whole world. Back when we were broke and happy, living in a tiny apartment that smelled like coffee and rain. We used to dream about road trips, adoption, a garden in the backyard. I remember him saying, "It'll always be us, Emily, no matter what." But somewhere between his mother moving in and the silence that followed, us started fading. Linda had a way of twisting everything. If I cooked dinner, she'd say, "Daniel likes it spicier." If I cleaned, she'd find a spot I missed. If I spoke up, she'd say, "You're too emotional." And Daniel, he just drifted. He stopped laughing at my jokes. He stopped asking how my day went. Some nights, he'd fall asleep with his back turned to me, and I'd stare at the ceiling, wondering when love had become something I had to earn. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the confusion. How could the man who once held my trembling hands through my father's funeral now ignore me like a stranger? I started to shrink. I'd cancel plans with friends so I wouldn't have to explain the dark circles or the forced smile. At school, I'd fake my cheerfulness, telling my students, "Remember, kindness matters," while I forgot what kindness felt like myself. Then, one afternoon, I got home early from work. Daniel's car was in the driveway, and for a second I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd planned something sweet. But as I stepped inside, laughter echoed from the kitchen. Two voices. Daniel and his mother, as always. But this time, they were whispering about me. Linda said, "She doesn't belong in this family. You could have done better." Daniel sighed and replied, "I know, Mom, I know." Those words didn't just hurt, they hollowed me out. It was like watching someone burn down the home you built together brick by brick. That night, I packed a small bag, not to leave, but to remind myself that I still could. I still had a choice, even if I didn't know what it was yet. I went to the porch and sat in the cold. The Oregon rain had started again, and it felt like it was washing something off me. The guilt, the shame, the lies I told myself to survive. And in that silence, I realized something simple but painful. You can love someone and still lose yourself trying to keep them. You can stay loyal to someone who doesn't even notice you're drowning. So I stopped waiting for him to save me. Because maybe I was the only one who still could.
The night I overheard Daniel agreeing that he could have done better, something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not violently, just a quiet, clean break, the kind that changes you forever. For weeks, I moved through the house like a ghost. I spoke only when necessary, smiled only when someone was watching. Inside, a storm was building, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that clears everything out. One morning, while I was grading my students' spelling tests, my friend and coworker Lily leaned over and whispered, "You look tired, Em. You okay?" And I almost lied. I almost said, "I'm fine," but the truth slipped out like a whisper I'd been holding for too long. "I think my husband hates me." She didn't flinch. She just squeezed my hand and said, "Then stop loving him more than yourself." That line, it burned into me, because that's exactly what I'd been doing. That weekend, Daniel came home late, smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. I asked, "Where were you?" He shrugged. "Out with clients." I said nothing, but my gut screamed the truth. And the next morning, when I saw a lipstick stain on his shirt collar, a color Linda would never wear, I knew. It wasn't just emotional betrayal anymore. He had crossed the final line. The anger came fast, raw, and cold. Not the kind that makes you throw things, but the kind that makes you see everything clearly. All the times I made excuses, all the times I believed he's just stressed, All the times I begged for love that was already gone. I confronted him that night. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look guilty. He just said, "You've been distant, Emily. What did you expect?" What did I expect? Maybe loyalty? Maybe basic decency? Maybe a husband who didn't cheat and let his mother run our marriage like a puppet show? But instead, he turned it on me. Like I was the problem. Like I had forced him into betrayal. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about love. This was about control, about power, about watching me break and calling it my fault. I looked at him, this man I once adored, and for the first time, I didn't feel sadness. I felt disgust. He left that night to clear his head. Linda stayed behind as if guarding what was left of her kingdom. She looked at me and said, "You should have tried harder to keep him." I laughed. I actually laughed, because there it was, the final insult. Maybe he should have tried harder not to lose me. She glared, but I didn't care. Something inside me had shifted, permanently. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I started planning. Because when someone destroys your heart, the only thing left to do is rebuild it into armor. And I promised myself they wouldn't see it coming. When Daniel walked out that night, I thought I'd feel free. But freedom doesn't come wrapped in silence. It comes with echoes, with ghosts, with the sound of a door closing on the life you thought you had. For days, I couldn't move. The house felt foreign, every room filled with memories that no longer belonged to me. His jacket still hung by the door, his toothbrush still sat beside mine. I couldn't throw them away, not yet. It felt like admitting defeat. Linda, of course, stayed. She moved through the kitchen like she owned it, cooking meals I couldn't eat, humming hymns like some kind of dark comfort. "You'll see," she said one morning. "He'll come back when you apologize." Apologize. For what? For existing wrong? For not being the kind of woman she could mold? I didn't answer. I just stared at the wall and wondered if love was supposed to hurt this way. I stopped going out. I stopped answering texts from Lily. The world felt too bright, too loud, like I didn't belong in it anymore. Even the kids at school noticed. "Miss Parker, are you sad?" one little girl asked. And I smiled the only way I knew how, the kind that hides pain so well it starts to look natural. At night, I'd sit on the floor beside the bed and scroll through old photos. Daniel and me on our wedding day, smiling, young, stupidly hopeful. Daniel holding my hand when I got the teaching job. Daniel whispering, "I'll always choose you." What a cruel joke that turned out to be. The worst part wasn't losing him. It was losing the version of myself that believed in him. I missed her. The Emily who laughed easily, who trusted too quickly, who believed people were mostly good. Now I barely recognized my reflection. My eyes looked older. My voice sounded tired, even to myself. It's strange how betrayal ages you faster than time ever could. One night, I drove to the cliffs outside town, the place where Daniel once proposed. The ocean below roared, wild and merciless. I stood there in the wind, clutching my coat, and whispered, "What did I do wrong?" And for a terrifying second, I didn't have an answer. Because maybe it wasn't me. Maybe love isn't something you can fail at alone. That night, I cried until I had nothing left, the kind of crying that empties you out completely, leaves you hollow, weightless, quiet. When I finally stopped, I looked up at the stars and felt something small but certain stir inside me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hope. It was a flicker of survival.
Because if I could stand there broken and breathing after everything they'd done, maybe I wasn't done yet. Maybe this was what rebirth felt like before it had a name. The morning light spilled softly through my apartment window, touching everything with a golden warmth I hadn't felt in months. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to open my eyes. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. I stood there for a moment, holding a cup of coffee, just watching the city breathe below me. It had been nearly a year since everything fell apart, since I lost my job, my marriage, and the version of myself I thought would last forever. I'd gone through anger, grief, and numbness, but this morning felt different. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally stopped fighting the pain. I let it teach me instead. Last week, I revisited that park, the one where I used to meet Ryan for coffee before work. I sat on the same bench and watched strangers pass by, laughing, talking, living. I didn't cry this time. I smiled. Because somehow, in that moment, I understood. Life doesn't stop for your heartbreak. It keeps moving and invites you to join when you're ready. That's when I decided to forgive. Not just Ryan, not just my boss who chose someone younger and cheaper, but myself for staying too long, for believing too hard, for losing my sense of worth. I realized forgiveness wasn't about excusing what happened. It was about freeing myself from what kept me tied to the past. That night, I wrote a letter to Ryan. I didn't send it. I didn't need to. I just needed to say the words out loud, to set them free. I told him that I hoped he found peace, that I hope he learned to be better. And then I wrote something that surprised even me. Thank you for breaking me, because I never would have rebuilt myself this strong. I burned the letter in a small metal bowl on my balcony, watching the ashes swirl into the cool air. It wasn't sadness that filled me. It was release. It was gratitude. A few weeks later, I took a road trip along the California coast, just me, the ocean, and the sound of my favorite playlist. I stopped at small diners, talked to strangers, took photos of places I'd never seen before. There was one night near Big Sur where I parked by the cliffs, watching the waves crash below under the moonlight. I remember whispering to myself, "You made it." It wasn't triumph. It was peace. The kind that comes when you've walked through hell and finally see the sunrise. Since then, I've started something new. Not a relationship, but a small blog. I write about healing, about learning to rebuild your life when the ground has fallen away beneath you. I called it Broken Open, because sometimes that's what we are. Not broken apart, but broken open to something new. People began sharing their own stories. Some were about divorce, some were about losing a job, some were about losing themselves. And every time someone commented, "I thought I was the only one," I realized that none of us really are. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that pain is a bridge, not a prison. It takes you somewhere, if you let it. It strips away everything fake, everything you thought you needed, and shows you what's real. So if you're listening right now, maybe sitting in your car after a long day or lying in bed wondering why it had to happen to you, this is what I want you to know. You will survive this. You will not just get through it, you will grow through it. And one day you'll wake up, the way I did, to a quiet morning full of sunlight, and you'll realize you're finally free. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting what happened, but remembering it without pain. Not going back to who you were, but becoming who you were always meant to be. Sometimes I still get scared. Sometimes the memories creep in. But instead of running from them, I think them. They remind me that I lived, that I cared deeply, that I tried, and that's something to be proud of. I don't know what the future holds. None of us do. But I do know this. I'm not afraid anymore. Not of love, not of loss, not of starting over. Because I've learned that everything you lose teaches you something you couldn't have learned any other way. So here's my story. Not of revenge, but of resurrection. Not of bitterness, but of becoming. And if my story finds you in the dark tonight, I hope it helps you believe that your light is still waiting. Take a deep breath, let it hurt, then let it go. Because one day you'll thank the pain for leading you home.
It's strange how, when you stop searching for closure, life hands it to you in unexpected ways. A few months after my trip, I got an email from an old coworker, the one who'd quietly watched everything unfold when I was pushed out of my job. She told me the company had gone downhill, that the same manager who replaced me had been fired for cutting corners. I didn't feel the satisfaction I once thought I'd crave. No victory dance, no "I told you so," just peace. Because by then, I'd already moved on. My world had shifted. I was freelancing for small businesses, helping them tell their stories online, something I'd always loved but never had the courage to do full-time. It didn't make me rich, but it gave me something far more valuable: freedom. One afternoon, while working at a cafe downtown, I overheard a young woman crying softly at the next table. Her laptop was open, her resume on the screen, and I saw that same lost expression I'd worn not so long ago. I hesitated, then leaned over and said gently, "Rough day?" She looked up startled, then nodded, tears catching in her lashes. "I just got laid off. I don't even know what to do next." For a second, I was looking at my past self, the panic, the shame, the disbelief. So I told her my story. Not the dramatic version, not the painful details, just the truth. That it hurts, that it's okay to fall apart, that it's not the end. She listened quietly, then whispered, "Thank you. I really needed to hear that." When she smiled to her tears, I realized something profound. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a bridge. That night, I updated my blog again. I wrote, "We all think the pain will destroy us, but maybe it's carving out space for something new. Maybe our heartbreak is just life making room for growth." I didn't expect much, but that post went viral. Thousands of comments poured in, people sharing their losses, their fears, their small victories. Some said they printed my words and taped them to their mirrors. Others said they finally quit a toxic job or walked away from someone who never saw their worth. And in every message, I felt the same heartbeat. We just want to be understood. That's when I started hosting live sessions, virtual meetups every Sunday evening. At first, it was 10 people, then 50, then hundreds. Strangers from all over the country showing up with coffee mugs and quiet hope. We didn't talk about success or revenge. We talked about healing, about rebuilding, about forgiving ourselves. Sometimes I'd end the session by saying, "We may be broken, but we are not beyond repair." And somehow, those words healed me, too. One night after finishing a session, I got a message from someone named Olivia, a middle-aged woman from Texas. She said my story helped her leave an abusive marriage after 15 years. She ended her message with, "I finally feel alive again. Thank you for reminding me that I deserve more." I stared at that message for a long time. It hit me that my pain, the same pain I once begged to go away, had become a compass for someone else. A few weeks later, a podcast producer reached out, asking if I'd share my story on their show. My first instinct was fear, my voice shaking, my past exposed again. But then I thought of Olivia, of the girl in the cafe, of every person who'd said, "You made me feel less alone." So I said yes. When the episode aired, I sat on my couch listening to my own voice echo through my headphones. I expected to feel nervous. Instead, I felt proud. Every word that once felt like a scar now sounded like strength. After that, things began to change. Opportunities came: writing features, speaking events, collaborations with mental health organizations. I wasn't chasing success, I was living in alignment. I was finally doing something that mattered. One afternoon, I found myself standing on stage at a small conference in Portland. The lights were warm, the audience quiet. I shared my story, not the pain, but the lessons.
And as I looked out at the faces before me, I ended with this. If you're in the dark right now, please remember, you're not broken. You're becoming. The pieces you're rebuilding will shine brighter than before. Because sometimes, the worst thing that ever happened to you becomes the reason someone else survives. The applause wasn't loud. It was soft, steady, full of heart. The kind that feels like understanding. When I walked off that stage, I didn't feel like a survivor anymore. I felt like a storyteller, a bridge, a reminder that even shattered glass can reflect light. And in that moment, I finally understood this was the purpose behind the pain. Not to destroy me, but to reshape me. To make me someone who could turn hurt into hope and silence into connection. Maybe that's what life does to all of us when it feels cruel. It's just preparing us to help someone else climb out of the same darkness. And that's how I found peace. Not in forgetting the past, but in using it to light the way forward.
It's been 3 years since that day. The day everything fell apart and started again. Sometimes I still wake up thinking about the betrayal, the silence, the nights I couldn't breathe. But now, those memories don't hurt the same way. They've softened, like scars that no longer ache. Reminders, not wounds. I walk through life differently now, slower, kinder. I notice small things, sunlight through the kitchen window, the smell of coffee, the sound of laughter from a stranger. Things I once took for granted when I was too busy chasing approval, too scared of being alone. People still ask me if I ever forgave them, the ones who betrayed me. And the truth? I did. Not because they deserved it, but because I did. Carrying anger was like drinking poison and waiting for them to die. Letting go wasn't weakness, it was freedom. Sometimes I still get messages from people who've heard my story. They tell me about their pain, a cheating spouse, a backstabbing friend, a family that turned its back. And every time I tell them what I learned the hard way. You can't control who breaks you, but you can control who you become after. That's what healing is. Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't matter, but choosing to build something stronger from the ashes. If you're listening to this right now, maybe you're in that dark place too. Maybe you've been betrayed, abandoned, or made to feel like you don't matter. I see you. I've been you. And I promise, it won't always hurt like this. One day, you'll wake up and realize the pain doesn't define you anymore. The storm that tried to drown you has taught you how to swim. And when that happens, don't just move on, reach back. Tell your story. Be the hand that pulls someone else from the fire. Because healing multiplies when it's shared. So if my story touched you today, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. Subscribe, not for me, but for the reminder that we rise again together. Because maybe, just maybe, the next person who hears your story will find the courage to begin again. And that's how the healing continues, one honest story at a time.